Welcome, everybody, to Krystal and Kyle After Dark.
Is that our new name?
Yes, we have to change the name of the podcast now. Just kidding, you wish. Anyway, welcome to Krystal, Kyle, and Friends. Got a lot of stuff to talk about today. We have a great interview coming up with a writer of a book on Occupy Wall Street, and so we're going to get into the upsides of it, the downsides of it, and everything in between, what the legacy of it, where it pushed us in terms of history, the direction it took us, what grew out of it, so on and so forth. So that should be interesting.
Yes, indeed. The book is fascinating. For me, it was very thought-provoking to think about the way that movement shaped the past decade, the sort of promises of that movement and how and why they fell short. The framing of it, the 99 versus the 1, which I think is a lot better than the framing that the left has today. So I'm excited to talk to him about all those things.
Yeah, very true. Before we get into that, though, there's two things that caught my eye. First, Krystal, I'll let you take it over. There's something that happened in San Francisco, which is a pretty big story, and I think we should weigh in on it.
Yeah, this is getting a lot of attention. So 3 school board members in San Francisco, on the San Francisco school board, were just recalled. The vote was pretty overwhelming.
Over 70%, right?
Yeah, in favor of these 3 members being removed from the board. I'll read from you the local coverage. They say the recall, and this is their analysis of what the issues were. The recall divided the city for the past year with a grassroots effort of frustrated parents and community members pushing for the trustees' removal over the slow reopening of schools during the pandemic and the board's focus on controversial issues like renaming 44 school sites and ending the merit-based admission system at Lowell High School. So a similar thing with that high school. This was like, one of their top high schools that you used to have to test to get into. They switched it to a lottery system. Just like that's been controversial in New York, especially among the Asian American community. There was a similar backlash in San Francisco over that specific issue. Basically, the sense was that people felt like, oh, you're just changing this because there are too many Asians getting into this high school. So that created a backlash. But really the core of this issue was that they kept the schools closed for a long time. And while the schools were closed, instead of focusing on, hey, how do we get the schools reopened and make sure kids can be in classes safely, they were focused on renaming 44 different schools, one of which was named after Abraham Lincoln. You guys probably saw that in the news.
And there's one after George Washington, too.
Yeah, apparently Sagar was telling me one of them was named after Dianne Feinstein.
That's right.
Which is hilarious.
Space? Did they change that one?
No, actually, I no longer support the recall. But just to give you a sense, this really there was very strong support for the recall effort within the Chinese community, the Chinese American community specifically, but also mainstream support in the city. London Breed, the mayor of San Francisco, supported the recall effort, specifically for the reason that, their priorities were misplaced during this pandemic. She wanted them focused more on getting the schools reopened instead of what she considered to be superfluous issues. The people who were opposed to the recall of these 3 individuals, they used some sort of typical arguments. First of all, they tried to say, oh, this is outside funded, it's outside money coming in. I'm sure there was some outside money, but there was very clearly...
That's always stupid. It's like, we live in America. If Americans are against what you're doing,
yeah,
that's what happened.
It was very clear. I think it's very dismissive.
As long as it's not big money. As long as it's not big money, like from corporations or billionaires funding, then I have a problem with it. But if it's regular people in Idaho who are like, I'm concerned about that, then go ahead, I don't care.
Look, there may have been some big dollar donations. I'm not sure. But I think to dismiss this as some sort of just astroturfed movement.
It's hollow.
Clearly wasn't the case. And then what the Board of Supervisors president, who was against the recall, who wanted these members to stay on the board, this was the argument that they made. They said Trump's election and bold prejudice brought a lot of that out. Even in our democratic and liberal city, there are a lot of people who do not want people of color making decisions in leadership, even though the voters said that is what they want. So basically blaming Trump and racism.
Yeah, that's a dodge.
One other thing, it's a total dodge.
Yeah.
And I think it's relevant to that context. There are 7 members of the board. 6 of them are people of color. And so it wasn't like it was just people of color on the board.
I will say, though, I did read one article, I think it was in the Washington Post, that said that the people who were organizing the recall election did go on Glenn Beck's show. So it is fair to say there was some cozying up to right-wing media, if you will.
Sure.
But that's still the core of the argument is still incredibly silly. You can't just swat it all aside and
Well, and let me also just say, as a parent.
Well, I was going to ask you. I was going to go through. So let's do that now.
Yeah.
Let's go through the things, and I'll see what you think. I'll tell you what I think the biggest issue that I'm interested to dive into is the renaming of the schools. So, but put that aside for a second. Let's go thing for thing. The first one is the reopening of schools. So you're in that district. You see what's going on. What's your position on it? Go ahead.
Look, I think that at the beginning of the pandemic, there was it's very understandable to shut the schools because we just didn't know a lot of information about how the virus would spread, who would be most vulnerable, how to most effectively protect people. And so, I pulled my kids out even a little bit before our school districts closed because we just didn't know. At this point, and fairly quickly, we saw that virtual learning is a disaster, that the costs that are imposed on kids, especially poor kids, disproportionately kids of color, by having schools shuttered is not worth the benefit. And in fact, there has been very little evidence that closing schools even stopped the spread of the virus. So yes, I know that this is a very touchy subject, but at this point, the data is pretty clear that the learning loss and the psychological costs of having schools shuttered for extended periods of time was very damaging to kids. So I'm definitely on the side of they should have, and they kept their schools closed a long time. They should have reopened sooner.
So in one way, I'm actually more conservative than you on this question, because I remember early on in the pandemic when everything was sort of slowly shutting down, and it was a piecemeal shutdown. It wasn't like a national, federal level shutdown. It was like, locality, city, state, whatever. Things were shutting down. I remember I actually was against it, although I was tepid in opposing it. But because I was looking at Japan as the model at the time, and Japan basically had universal masking, and they had very low rates of COVID.
They were doing well.
So everything was open, but everybody was masked. So in a weird way, Kyle Kulinski, was the perfect mix of red state freedom and blue state safety. And I said, just wear your mask and everything will stay open and everything will be glorious. So in a way, I was never really in favor of maybe I said something at some point that was like tepidly in favor of the shutdowns, but I flipped on that very quickly because I saw Japan and I was like, everything's open. I like that, but everybody's masked up. So I'm with you on that. I will say though, to the argument about the data, I think people do talk about this too conclusively because, you could say the kids are psychologically worse off because they didn't go to school. But that is fundamentally a different thing from physically. You are going to be physically better off if you don't get the virus, even though the virus doesn't affect kids that bad. And like the whole thing about, because there was a study that came out recently, lockdowns only like lowered the spread rate by like 0.2% or whatever. And I look at that and I go, we never really did a shutdown. We never really had a COVID-0 policy. And obviously, everybody can imagine a scenario where there's a virus that's spreading like wildfire that has a 100% death rate. And then everybody, of course, would be like, we got to shut everything down. We have no choice. It's 100% death rate. If you get it, you die. So I just find that the dialogue around that is a little bit weaselly to me. And this is coming from somebody, again, I'm not in favor of the shutdowns. I was in favor of universal masking and keeping everything open. But we have to be honest enough to say that, like, there are, of course, scenarios where a virus could be bad enough where it's got like 100% death rate, where you have to shut down. And all these ideas of it only cuts at 0.2%. It's like, well, no, if you actually do a shutdown, if you actually have a COVID-0 policy, no, you can actually curtail the spread of the virus without a doubt.
But there is no evidence that shutting schools helped to stop the spread of the virus, either to kids or to their families or to teachers. So there isn't actually evidence that shutting schools benefited kids at all. And it didn't only affect their mental health. Kids' level of obesity among children shot up significantly. I mean, that's a health cost. You had increased rates of depression and anxiety. I mean, those are real health costs. And of course, you had massive learning loss that's going to potentially set them back
psychologically worse off versus physically worse off. But also, does this data even include other countries that did more complete shutdowns?
So other countries, by and large, prioritized keeping schools open. And a lot of other countries, European countries that had more aggressive shutdowns in general, and maybe more stringent masking requirements in general, also prohibited masking among children under 12. So we've been an outlier among our sort of peer developed nations in terms of school shutdowns and in terms of masking kids. And obviously our death statistics have been horrendous, so it has not done much good for us to have shut down schools. And at this point, the data is actually very clear about the benefits of school closures, which again, at the beginning, I think totally justifiable and understandable, and we didn't know. But at this point, knowing all that we do, I think it is very clear that the benefits of closing schools were not sufficient to offset the costs.
In the case of this particular virus, like I said, I'm sort of with you because I would have never shut them down in the first place.
Yeah, well, I'm only talking about this virus. I'm not saying always, ever.
The reason why I'm so skittish is because I've seen so many absolute idiots so conclusively say, lockdowns never work, and it's like, if a virus comes along that's way more deadly and spreads way faster than COVID, these idiots will be saying that. And it's like, that is literally our only place to shut shit down.
I'm not even talking about lockdowns in general. I'm just talking about schools and kids.
But a lockdown is a school shutdown. I'm just using the same language to talk about the same thing.
I'm specifically talking about schools because also, I mean, the other factor here is we know that COVID is less of a risk to children and has been much, much, much less deadly to them. And so that's also important.
Second order issue of they spread it to the adults. That is all part of the consideration.
The other piece, I'm actually curious your thought on this one, because the other piece is, at this point, before you get the vaccines, I think that's a different landscape. Once you have the vaccines and they're broadly available,
totally different story.
Then it's a different story.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you're talking about hurting kids to protect adults who couldn't do the basic thing of go get themselves vaccinated to protect themselves. And that I'm not on board with.
Yeah, well, like I said, in some ways I was to the right of you on the question to begin with because... And in some countries, this would be considered to the left of you, not the right of you, because different countries with different political factions.
This doesn't line up
Some left-wing parties were very, let her rip because they believe in freedom and liberty and all that stuff. And some left-wing parties in some countries, like in the U.S., were more along the lines of, no, we need to protect safety, security, all that stuff. So anyway, the political lines are muddled. But yeah, I would say, like I said, I totally understand everybody being upset over the slow reopening of schools. I think I would have been upset about it as well. And so on that front, I think they deserve the criticism that they got, even though I think the topic more generally deserves a lot more nuance and complexity than most people are willing to give it credit for. I see a lot of morons who are not respecting the complexity and the nuance of it and barking their opinion like they know what they're talking about and they don't know what they're talking about.
Here's the piece that I think that the health and well-being children data piece, to me, that piece is pretty clear based on the evidence. The part I think is more complicated is, especially with Omicron, how infectious it was and how many breakthrough cases that there were. I mean, there were school systems that genuinely had an issue of just like, our entire staff is sick. Like, we don't have the personnel to keep schools open right now. Now, I still think that keeping the doors of schools open should be a priority and that, extreme efforts should have been made to keep the doors open. I think those sort of practical considerations ended up being challenging during Omicron. Okay,
so more or less agreement with nuances on that point. Mm-hmm. But so now I understand the frustration over the renaming of the 44 schools, particularly during a crisis where it's like, you should be focusing on this. Like, what are you doing? Yeah. This is like your priorities are all out of whack. I will say, though, in the broader conversation about renaming the schools, I do find the people who are just resistant to it in principle to be annoying as hell.
Yeah.
The people who are like, I'm surprised you agree with me on this, because even like we're renaming George Washington School, because I think in some ways people are actually super conservative, but they don't think it's conservatism. And this is one of those ways. Like the whole deifying the founding fathers and whatnot. It's like, look, that's part of the national mythology. And when you look at people in Iran who do that about the Ayatollahs and whatnot with the 1979 revolution, it's like you can realize how stupid it is when you see other countries do it. But then when you look at our founding fathers, many of them had slaves. Many of them wore powdered wigs and shat in outhouses. And everybody has to pretend like they're mega geniuses. Oh, my God, they're so right about everything. Oh, and it's like, you're actually being kind of ridiculous. So even though given the context of how they changed the names, it's like, I get it. Focus on the more important things. So I understand being pissed off about it in this context.
Yeah.
But more broadly speaking, I think everybody needs to come to the realization that if you're going to deify things, if you're going to put their names on buildings or put up statues or whatever, I really want it to be people who are unassailable. Like, I really want Martin Luther King statues instead of, some slave-owning founding father. I really want the Jonas Salk, who came up with the polio vaccine and fucking gave it away for free and could have made millions of dollars on it. He was like, no, would you patent the sun? I'm not going to. So, and almost nobody agrees with me on this point. Almost everybody's like, tradition, keep it up. And it's like, oh, I get how that's easier because it's the lazy thing to do. And it's just like, you just don't have to change anything so nobody gets pissed off. You just leave it as is. But I just don't think that the idea is as crazy as people pretend it is. Like, it only stems from wokeness. It's like, it's got nothing to do with wokeness.
Well,
it's about if you're building a society, do you want to have like false idols that are obviously stupid, or do you want to maybe try to do a little better? and maybe have idols that are more above the fray and genuinely good people. And somebody can even say my MLK example, say, well, he cheated on his wife, so maybe his statue couldn't go up. Okay, fair enough. Maybe we don't have statues and shit. But you see my broader point, though? It's like, I don't know why people get triggered about, like, let's change the name of a Confederate school, or and to be fair, Abraham Lincoln and George Washington are not Confederate. But just the idea in general of changing the names, I have no problem with it.
Okay, so here's the context in which it bothers me. I mean, the sort of what you point out of they're focused on, like, let's rename the Abraham Lincoln School and the Dianne Feinstein School, while they should be focused on. Because I feel like that's why I have a knee-jerk reaction against some of these efforts, because I think routinely they're used as like, well, we're not going to do anything that's like really going to change life for...
Let's do the fake thing.
Let's do the fake thing.
Yeah.
Let's do the theatrical. It's easy to change the name. Let's have a whole thing about it and vote on it. And it's a whole public controversy and everybody gets sucked into this stupid culture war bullshit that isn't going to put food on the table or help a single person make rent. And so that's why the second I see a lot of focus going to one of these efforts, that's why I have a knee-jerk reaction against it, because that's what we see routinely happening in the Democratic Party. And so I'm not ideologically opposed to renaming schools, buildings, certainly taking down monuments. I mean, some of them are very obvious that they
fucking Confederate monuments. People get triggered when they pull Confederate monuments. It's like, really?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like, I have no ideological objection to any of those things, and I don't really care if you rename Abraham Lincoln Middle School or whatever to someone and rename it after a labor leader or something else. I don't care. But what I do have a knee-jerk reaction against is the fact that oftentimes these are used to cover for the fact that you're not doing anything else. And we
Total agreement on that. I agree with you on that.
Yeah, and we actually... Sagar and I had an interview with Adolph Reed about his book, The South. We talked to him a little bit about it when we interviewed him, but the book wasn't out yet. And it's all about him growing up under Jim Crow. And it's an attempt, it's not really a memoir. He uses his own personal experiences to illustrate what was happening in the country on a broader basis, both in his childhood and then as things changed growing up. And he talks about... He grew up in Louisiana. He grew up in New Orleans. He talks about when those Confederate monuments were taken down. You remember Mitch Landrieu? And that was a big deal, and he gave a very stirring and moving speech. And it wasn't that it didn't mean something to him, because it did. It really did mean something to him. And to have these monuments, and you know the context in which they were put up, you know, during the Jim Crow, to try to put Black people back in their place, it meant something to him. But he also had this recognition of, yeah, but... you know, Landrieu and all these people, they're still serving the same corporate masters, and they're not willing to actually do anything to fundamentally change things. So that's kind of the framework that I generally view these things in. And it's hard on these culture war issues to have that fuller context, because when you have the knee-jerk reaction against it, it just feels like you're like, oh, well, you're just opposed to, like, you know, getting rid of racism or whatever. But that's the piece of it that really bothers me.
I agree with everything you said there. Given the context of how they wanted to change it when you had much bigger crises going on, totally makes sense to want to recall them. And I'm not surprised the vote was over 70%. I probably would have voted for the recall as well.
Yeah.
I guess my actual position on the renaming of schools and the pulling down of Confederate monuments and things of that nature is like, I genuinely don't care either way. So if they stay up, I'm not going to be like, you have to take it down. But if somebody changes it, I'm also going to be like, okay. I'm not going to be like, you have to not change it because history and tradition and blah.
Right.
Everybody who gets passionate about it annoys me for some reason. You understand what I'm saying?
I do.
And I think particularly because of the point you made, which is like, really, it's all just window dressing fundamentally.
Well, and the reaction against it is window dressing.
Right, that's the thing I'm
sins.
trying to say. That's the exact thing I'm trying to say, yeah. So let's get to the final point of this. And actually, I read they got rid of gifted and talented programs, too, and people were pissed about that.
Oh, I'm not sure about that.
I saw that in the Washington Post article.
Yeah, that could be.
Now, on that front, I think you should keep the program, but I will say, I'm going to be politically correct, Kyle, for a second here, because I don't like the name gifted and talented. Where I was from in New York, we called it AP classes. AP was an acronym for advanced placement.
But that's a different thing. So so growing up in King George County, where my kids also go to public schools, we had AP classes, which were like the ones that you take the AP test at the end of, and you get college credit if you get a 4 or 5.
Okay.
As at least how it worked when I was going to high school a million years ago. But they're also separately, especially for elementary school kids, is a TAG, talented and gifted program. So I think they're
Yeah.
two different things.
So I think the reason I get triggered about that is because if you're calling, like, you're in the gifted and talented class,
Yeah.
you're saying to the other kids, you're not gifted or talented.
Yeah.
And I think that could crush their, their trust in themselves. And I also think it sort of curses the kids who are in the class because they feel like if I'm gifted and talented, I don't even have to work harder because I'm already gifted and talented. So I could just coast on my gifted and talentedness.
Yeah, it also, I mean, the concerns that have been raised, I don't have a great, like, fully thought out view on these programs because I think it is kind of complicated. Oftentimes, the kids who get selected into it, it's more a representation of their class status than their actual, like, gifted.
So that gets to the final
status.
point
Yeah.
that I wanted to make, because the other thing was they eliminated the merit admission system.
Mm-hmm.
And the result of that was it's overwhelmingly Asian.
The merit system had it being
the merit
overwhelmingly
system
Asian.
made it so that it was way more Asian students that were
Yeah.
coming in. So my question to you is, you look at that and you say, look, it is what it is. I support the merit system, and that's that. Or do you have some other factor that you would add into the mix to change the formula by which they determine who goes to the school?
I think it's hard to do that without ending up just like overt anti-Asian discrimination.
So
Because this is what the Ivy Leagues tried to do. And did you read the reports on how they were trying to filter out Asian applicants? I mean, they would use things like these very squishy, like, personality metrics of, oh, they're just not a good leader. And it was very played into a lot of anti-Asian tropes and stereotypes to try to change their ratios to be what they wanted.
Here's the counter argument, though. The counter argument, though, is that we're presupposing that as of right now, it actually is based on merit. Like, we're just granting into the conversation that the system they call merit-based is merit-based, when the fact of the matter is we all know, especially when it comes to colleges, they have all these legacy programs and whatnot that are just affirmative action for spoiled rich kids. It's like, oh, your dad went to the school, so now you're going to get into the school.
Yes.
And so in a million and one ways...
most of those kids are white, by the way.
Yes. In a million and one ways, the merit system actually isn't based on merit. So when people try to come up with new formulas to make it more fair, they're actually trying to make it in a weird way more merit-based. So when I look, I'm not pro-affirmative action, but I am pro-affirmative action based on class. And if you do it based on class, you're going to get a rainbow coalition. You're going to get a multiracial group of everybody. Because, look, if you go to a school that's chronically underfunded, you don't have as much of a shot at getting into an amazing university, and you may have done a phenomenal job, but given the limits of the school you went to, like, you may be asked out unless they have some sort of a program that says we're going to factor in the fact that you didn't have as many resources growing up, so maybe you deserve to go to the school.
Well, I have a hard time getting super spun up on this debate because I think the whole structure and the way we think about the meritocracy is so fucked to start with.
I agree.
That it's such a, it's so high stakes to get designated as the gifted kid and have these certain specific skills which are valued by the market, and to get into the special high school and to get into the special college. I mean, this is the conversation we had with Freddie DeBoer about how, no, we need to acknowledge that, not everybody starts at the same level in terms of what they're good at and what they're not good at. Not everybody has the same ability to achieve in these certain, super, valued by the market skills. And so what we need to do is create a different economy and different set of structures and supports so that if you aren't the gifted and talented kid going to Lowell High School, is the name of this high school in San Francisco, which is funny because my son's named Lowell, then your life is still going to be fine. You're still going to be okay.
That's
and then
why
these debates become a lot less tense and fraught, where it's oh my God, there's massive parent backlash that their kid's not going to be able to get into the special school anymore. Well, now you're going to be okay either way.
Well, that's why you need to do not just free college, but also free trade school. So you give everybody an avenue, no matter what. You're going to have an avenue. You're going to have a path. The way it works now, people get all the way up through high school, and they're just sort of dumped out in the real world, and it's you're kind of on your own. I want that to continue up through college or through trade school, and then you can get a head start in life in a way. But yeah, I generally like the idea of merit-based. The thing is, we need to stop pretending that figuring out what merit is as simple as it sounds, because it's not.
Well,
class affirmative action, I don't think is a bad idea. I think that's actually a wonderful idea.
I agree with. I'm fine with class affirmative action. I think it makes sense to have kids who are, particularly just happen to have an aptitude for communication or for math or for science or whatever, to be in an environment where that can be nurtured and where they're around other kids who have similar gifts in those areas. What I object to is then just saying like the rest of y'all don't matter and good luck out there in the world, because if you don't make it into this group and you didn't happen to win the genetic lottery to have these particular gifts, then you're basically going to be screwed. Gotcha.
So recall, you ultimately would have voted for it. I would have voted for it. Let's hope that whoever replaces them is better.